So this topic is one of the most interesting for me. The hardest thing to do, second hardest thing to do in computer science, naming stuff. And we'll have Paweł Lewtak talk a bit about it.
Hello. Thank you for coming. I'm Paweł Lewtak. I'm a developer at GOG.com, and I'm going to share some experience regarding naming things. But before we start, let's answer the question, what's the most important thing in IT? What is it? What's the first thing, and so on. So this guy, Phil Carlton, in early 90s said that there are two hard problems in IT, cache invalidation and naming things. So sometime later, also in the 90s, another guy said that, okay, it's cache, naming, and off by one errors. Today, we're gonna focus on the second one. It's naming things. Cache invalidation is really important, so let's leave it for some other talk. And naming things, what I mean by things. Things is basically anything that depends on you. It's functions, names, method names, classes names, modules, comments, Git commits as well. Everything that is up to you, how you name it. Why this problem, why this idea of naming things is really important? The thing is that you don't write code for CPU. You don't know what CPU will be used by the end user, so it's not your problem, unless you're writing in assembler. You're not writing for interpreter. You might be writing in some language that is interpreted, like PHP, Python. You might write using language, some technology that is compiled, but still, you're not writing the code to be compiled. You're writing the code, well, there's one exception, unless you want to write Skynet, or you're living in a matrix. But if not, then you're writing code for people. Not for the end user, but for the developers. You're writing code for the next person that is going to take over your code in some time, some weeks, months. But what is more important is that you're writing code for your future self. If you don't care about naming today, and you will live this code for some time, after you go back to it in a few weeks, few months, you will probably won't remember how it works, why something was implemented one way or the other. So that's why naming things is so important to keep it in mind when working with code. There's a really nice presentation by Sławomir Sobutka. Unfortunately, it's in Polish, so most of you won't understand it. But the basic idea behind this talk is to write code like a prose, like a book. So it's really hard, but in some cases, when you really focus on it, it's possible to write code, so later it will be possible to read it like a book. So you read it once, don't need to focus on some implementation details on what's going on behind the scenes. You read it and you immediately know how it works. That's the perfect solution, not easy to do without some experience, but still possible. And last but not least, naming things is so important because let's say you have some new feature, some bug to fix, and before you write single line of code, you need to read existing code. You need to interpret it, you need to understand it, you need to, if you can, you might talk to people who wrote it before you. You sometimes talk to other people how it could be solved, how it could be implemented. And only then, once you get the idea what you want to write, only then you write it. Before that, it's mostly reading the code, figuring out the solution. Writing is really the small piece of our time. There's this developer and a designer, Karolina Szczur, that said similar thing, that you must keep in mind that you're not the only one that will work with your code. Possibly there's going to be somebody else who will take over this code, who will want to extend it, use it for own purposes. When you make naming better, you make other people's life easier. And that's the old quote from Donald Knuth that's said basically also the same thing, that we're not writing for computers, we're writing for people. Okay, so naming things improves our understanding of the code. If names are if the names have different meanings, many meanings, if it's not a single thing behind a variable, behind a method, you can't be sure what it really does without reading the full implementation. There was a research a few years ago that checked some open source applications like Eclipse IDE and a few others. And one of the results was that around 70% of the code, 70% of the characters in the source code are things that depend on the developer. So 70% of the source code is up to you. That's all the names you put in the code. So that's really big responsibility you have to remember about. All the code samples are written in Python, but it's so simple, I hope it doesn't matter. So if we were to write code for some CPU, interpreter, parser, whatever, then names are not important. We can use whatever we want, like shortest name possible, it will work. But if we want to understand what it does exactly, it's hard, right? Because you have to read the whole thing, try step by step to understand what it does. If instead you use meaningful names for function name, for parameter, for internal parameter, then it looks like this. You see a function called median, and you know, okay, this calculates median value from a pool. I don't need to read implementation. I just saved 5 minutes. And it's just one function. If you do this with all your code, that's gonna be so big time saver for everyone. And a side effect of that is that we end up with having self-documented code. You don't need extra documentation on what it's doing because you can read it. Names are meaningful, and just by reading it once, you know what's happening inside. I bet some of you had this case when you're reading some piece of code. It's not really that beautiful or easy to understand, and then you spot some obvious bug. You run git blame, and it's you. It happened to me a few times. So if I were to write better names in the past, I would be so much more grateful today. So keep that in mind. If you do better work today, your future self will be thankful to you. And quickly before we go to the naming thing, this is how I understand programming. So client comes to you with some problem to solve. You talk to him, you translate it into your terms you are going to use internally, and then write the solution. And that can lead to many problems. If you understand same things differently, you and your customer, if you're using different terms, you can use different words for same thing, basically. So what I suggest you to do is try domain-driven design approach. Using that, we end up using business terms in our code. And later on, when we need to extend something, fix something, we don't need this extra layer of translation between programming domain and business domain. It's also something that saves us a lot of time, allows us to avoid confusion later on. Okay, so does anybody of you know what's the worst variable name? Okay. Single variable names like here. No, single variable names are okay because in some contexts like loops, I is okay, right? The worst variable name possible is data. Because what type of data you can hold in variable called data? Well, it's data. So what's the second was variable name? Okay. Data too. If you use integers to distinguish different variables, that's a sign that you really need to refactor your code. Let's take a look at this code. We have total, total2, total3. It doesn't matter for a moment. And there's this check at the end if total2 is less than total3. Well, to understand it correctly, you need to go back, see the assignments, see the calculations, and figure out what is really being checked in this line. If we use proper names, meaningful names, we have something like this. And this condition is now if payable total is less than available total. So much easier to read, to understand, to fix, do whatever you want, to refactor even. And it reads more or less like a book. In May this year, there was a conference in Munich on web application called PyCon Web. And there, the keynote speaker, Rachel Wilmer, said that nobody sets out to write legacy code. And if you think about it, whenever you start a new project, you think, oh, I learned so much since last time. I saw so many cool talks at Webcam Zagreb. I'm so much more experienced developer right now. This project is going to be perfect. And we all have those assumptions at the beginning of every project, right? But there comes a time when you say, okay, this one time I will allow for this quick, ugly fix, this dirty hack to come into my code, but it's only once. But the truth is, once you allow such case once, it will be a second time, a third time, and in the end, your code will be bad, much better, worse shape. There's this thing called broken window theory. There was a study in 80s or 70s, I think. And long story short, it said that when there's an abandoned building with a lot of untouched windows, it will stay like this for some time. But whenever somebody breaks one window, really soon after that, you will see another one broken down, and the building will be demolished in no time, really. And it also applies to code. Once you allow this dirty hack, this quick fix to get into your code, it will be more common, and it could end up as a daily practice. Try to avoid this, because in the end, your code will decay. If you don't maintain it properly, if you don't care about naming, about upgrading your dependencies, let's say, it will be in such a state that it will require rewriting from scratch. In some cases, if you don't understand design patterns, you can end up with really bad, ugly code. If you're new to design patterns, you might think, oh, it's a perfect idea, let's use it. Let's use all the design patterns. And in the end, you might end up with really big, ugly mess if you don't know when to use design patterns, when to skip them. Okay, so some languages like Python have a thing called PEP8. In PHP, there's PSRs. Basically, it says about how more or less you should name things in your code, but it doesn't talk about, that's what these things are about. And it doesn't matter whether you choose camel case or some other way to name things, as long as you choose one thing and stick to this convention, is okay. If you mix different conventions, that's really bad. And I'm gonna skip talking about syntax because it's less interesting. What's important is semantics, the meaning behind all the words you use. Okay, so let's go through some most common basic issues I saw in the code. The first one is pseudo getter. Getter is basically a method of a class that should return some value. But there are cases where getter is doing some extra operation inside. So it's no longer really a getter, right? It returns some value and does something more. If it needs to create object first and then you can get it, it's, again, not a getter. There are so many nice words you could use to reflect what's happening inside, what's the intention behind the method. These are just a few examples. There's much more you could use. Another common issue I had, it happens mostly in languages that are not statically typed, is like method suggests you will get a boolean, but in return you get some string. That's really a mess if you need to work with such code, because you need to get into implementation to figure out that actually it doesn't return you a boolean. It's sometimes similar with validation. Validation returns only true or only false and skips the other possible output. Another common issue I saw in the code is that method name suggests that it will return you a list of some objects or a single object, and it ends up to returning the other one. So it's really confusing to work on when you expect to get a list of some things and you get just one element, not in form of a list. Another thing that I saw in code is misleading documentation. So once we had this method called getLowestPrice that accepted a user parameter. Well, seems innocent, right? You provide a user and in return you get the lowest price. But then somebody had some issue with that, and after some debugging, he figured out that actually this method returns the highest price. So instead of just changing the name, he added a one-line comment that it does the opposite. Yeah, it's funny, but the sad thing about this is that both the name and the comment are right in this case, because this method returned the highest price for anonymous user and the lowest price for logged-in user. So that should be split to two methods with meaningful name. Get price for anonymous user, get price for logged in, right? Then it's you don't need whether it's the highest, the lowest, what are the conditions inside. Names are more meaningful that way. And in this case, we have a case where a method has more than one responsibility. When a method does more than one thing, it tries to have multiple responsibilities, it's really hard to name it properly. Because either the name ends up being really long, or you skip some things in the name, and then the method turns up to do more than name suggests. Another minor thing is abbreviations. If you use them, it might be confusing because short name might be a shortcut for some different words, like pos could be positive or position, for example. Out could be authentication, authorization, and it's not obvious unless you read the full code. And synonyms is another issue. Like I said at the beginning, if you use business terms, business usually has one name for one thing. If you use different words to indicate one thing, one entity in your code, it's confusing. Somebody said that if you don't know how to name a class, name it manager, string manager, user manager, whatever manager. And you can pack all the methods related to that thing inside. But, well, there are so many useful alternatives to that. You could use so many different words that are actually meaningful, that say what's hidden inside the method, inside the class. I'm going to skip magic numbers, because that's quite obvious. Instead of using basically some hard-coded values, try to use constant values that have names. Useless comments is, well, basically most cases just repeating the method name in form of a comment. So that's not really useful, right? And the most important thing you should take away about comments is that you can fully skip what or how is implemented, because you can see it just by reading the code, right? You should focus on explaining why something was done, why it was implemented this way, why this algorithm was used, why this library was used and not some other. That's the most important thing you can leave in the comments. Okay, and last but not least, commit messages. That's also something that depends on you, and you should strive for having meaningful commit messages. If you have something like this, and I later try to revert some change, revert some things, I'm not able to find it when it's like this. Okay, so let's go quickly through some good practices. First thing, no generic names. If you have a generic name like manager, user manager, it's bad. Try to be specific. Try to give classes just one single responsibility, and that allows you to name it properly. Short names, it's quite obvious. Don't use negation. Yeah, whenever you use negation in method name, like having not, and then in a condition you have another negation, that adds extra layers that you need to go through to understand it properly. So instead of it's not enabled, you can use just is disabled. So much easier. And consistent names, it's, well, like I said before with synonyms, whenever you use some name, try to stick to it in the code, in the comments, in documentation as well. Okay, I talked about this, and well, simple advice is just think about it. Just instead of writing whatever comes to your mind, think about it for a minute, ask a friend, desk next to you, and try to find a good name. Some languages allows you to use Unicode characters in your code. Please don't use that. Use ASCII characters only. Tests are kind of documentation, I would say. It shows how your code could be used, but it's a side effect of good naming. Common messages. So there's a really nice documentation in Git. Nice example in Git documentation how good commit message should look like. Basically, it's one sentence summary of your changes, and below that, explanation why it was changed, what was the reasoning behind it, if it's needed. And how can we make sure that we stick to good naming, we enforce some quality in our code? First thing is that you should talk to your peers, to your team, and agree on some standards. What will we are going to use, how we want to name things, and then try to stick to it. And then after that, you can use Boy Scout rule. That's the rule that says that you should always leave the place you visited in the better shape. So whenever you're fixing some short method and you see that method next to it is in bad shape or it requires a refactor, try to do that. And just practice. Well, practice is something that helps us improve with everything. So the more you practice naming things, it gets easier. And read books, read blogs, read paper, mostly English because we write mostly in English. And when you read more, you have bigger vocabulary, you have more words you can use for naming things. And Refactor is time where you can use all this knowledge. You see some bad code that needs to be improved, and during Refactor you can simply improve this piece of code. Somebody said that when you do code review and you have really long code review, like 1,000 lines long or more, then mostly people just approve. But whenever you have short review, 10 lines, 50 lines, then you will get at least 10 request changes, because people put more attention into shorter code reviews. That way, we are able to spot naming problems as well. And we should all feel owners of the code we write within the team, because whenever we feel something is ours, we try to keep it in good shape for longer time. Yeah, and I said it twice already, committed messages are really important because it shows the idea behind some feature that was implemented across few commits, what was the flow behind changes in time. Okay, these are some research papers I mentioned before. You can read it. It's quite interesting, but I covered most of this in my talk. So thank you very much for listening. I'm not sure if we have time for questions.
Yeah, I think we can have. Does anybody have a question? Anyone? Okay, I have one. Do you have an example of a repository that we could go and look that has good naming?
Actually, I think most of open source software is really well kept in terms of naming, code style, and so on. I don't have any specific example of that.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. It was a great talk.